Hello, can everyone hear me? A couple of thumbs up. Welcome everyone to this meeting. This is the first meeting that's happening today on Sunday as part of the Socialism, Marxism in Scotland conference. So welcome everybody. If this is your first meeting, you didn't make it along to anything yesterday, welcome. There'll be a bunch of stuff for you to be involved in today. My name's Jade. Don't let my accent fool you. I know I sound like I come from one of your colonial outposts, but I'm a member of the Socialist Workers Party in Edinburgh. In just a second, I'm going to introduce our two fantastic speakers for this session that's about can capitalism survive coronavirus? But before we do that, we're going to play a little video. If people have been along to some of the sessions already, you'll have noticed that we're playing videos from artists, singers, songwriters, poets at the beginning. Part of the purpose of that is if you've come along to any of the conferences we have live, you would have seen before, you would have seen that we normally have a culture tent that happens every year. And I think it's pretty hard in an online format to try and bring a bit of that atmosphere of, the connections that artists and poets and activists are all making together. But so playing the videos at the beginning, we're trying to bring a bit of that sentiment and atmosphere into the conference. So the video that's going to be played is going to be a bunch of artists, poets and rappers who are based in Glasgow. They're all part of Extinction Rebellion in Glasgow. And their names are Natasha, Susie, Chats, and Alex, and the song is called Desire, Constrain, Contain. Sorry, Rory, I don't think anyone can hear that.
Sorry.
Desire, lust, constrained addiction. Desire, lust, failure to attain. It's conflict condition. Condition, seduce precision. Inhibition, inhibition. Desire, constrained condition. Desire, lust, constrained addiction. Desire, lust, failure to attain. Conflict condition. Remission, seduce precision. Inhibition. Desire, constrained condition. Desire, lust, constrained addiction. Desire, lust, failure to attain. Conflict condition. Remission, seduce precision. Inhibition. Liberate from the fake illusion. Design confusion. Design conflict. Design conflict. Humanity ruin. Demonize, weaponize ruin. From conception to contempt. Collect friends. Deposit fraud. Conquest. Foul intent. Defile in contest. Derail details. Contest. Hand the women. Mind to influence. Mind loosen. Violence. Stupor. Aisles. Fluid. Aisles. Isolation. Consent. There's no consent. There's no intent to protect. No preservation. Diffuse thought. Modes of thought. Conquest of thought. Conquest of who's what. Solve for thought. Off thought. Close feet. Foul play. Foul play. Onslaught. Credit onslaught. Remission. My addiction. Chemical addiction to you. Idealize your disguise. Idealize your lies. Deny love's design. Define the rail. Collide like butterflies design. Struggling for breath. Struggling suicide. From contrived decide to being invaded. Defined and unstable. Collide like mental fatigue's attraction. Unstable. Dissatisfaction. Desire, constrained condition. Desire, lust, constrained addiction. Desire, lust, failure to attain. Conflict condition. Remission, seduce precision. Inhibition, inhibition. Desire, constrained condition. Desire, lust, constrained addiction. Desire, lust, failure to attain. Conflict condition. Remission, seduce precision. Inhibition. Desire, constrained condition. Desire, lust, constrained addiction. Desire, lust, failure to attain. Conflict condition. Lies ahead, this carrot blood, breaking down the level they want, holding hands together, waiting for the last of the bell, wasting from the paper, working for the mechanism, making them so tender, waiting in the cell that we learn, talking ahead that we come down,
Oh, well, thank you for that incredibly energetic start to the meeting. I think it's probably the most revved up I've ever been at the start to a meeting about the question of Marxist economics. So I think we'll set a particular tone for the meeting. Thank you so much. I'm just going to introduce our two amazing speakers in a second. Just before then, a couple of things. The first thing is, obviously, there's plenty of time for questions, comments, and discussions in this session, and that will be after the two speakers finish. So if you have particular things you want to contribute, definitely, that would be excellent. I think that is the thing that really makes a meeting. If you have something that you're kind of interested in, you don't feel quite brave enough to put your hand up, also feel free to drop something in the chat as well, and we can read out a couple of those ones. And for people who maybe it's your first Zoom meeting, somehow you've survived the pandemic without having to go to a million of them, I'll explain how we're going to run the chat discussion once we get to the end of the meeting. The other thing I'll just mention as well before I introduce the speakers is that if you're keen to continue the discussions, debates, want to know more about what's going on this weekend, we also have a hub that we're running all weekend that will start after this discussion. So it's another Zoom room, but where you can go to that's a bit more informal, where we can kind of continue the discussions and the chats that have been going on in all the different sessions. So we are very, very lucky today to have Michael Roberts and Joseph Choonara, both coming to do some hopefully excellent introductions for us. Joseph is going to start. He's going to speak for around 20 minutes, then Michael will speak for 20 minutes. Joseph, for anyone who doesn't know, is an author, a writer of Unraveling Capitalism and the Reader's Guide to Capital, and he's also the editor of the International Socialist Journal, and there'll be a link to that dropped in the chat if you want to go have a look. Michael Roberts is also an author and just put out a fantastic new book called Engels 200, which is about Engels' contribution to political economy, and people should take a minute as well, I think, to check out Michael's really fantastic blog. There's I think the most recent article up there is about the whole question about vaccines and the politics around vaccines, which is just fascinating. So there'll be a link dropped in the chat as well for people to go check out some of the other things that Michael has written, but maybe make Joseph feel welcome and then we'll bring in Michael afterwards.
I think we were doing it the other way around, actually, if I'm not mistaken. So I think Michael was going to start first and I was going to go second, if that's okay.
Sounds great to me.
Yeah, okay.
Do you want me to start then?
That would be thanks, Michael.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to Marxism Scotland for my first participation in this particular conference, which will be very good. The lineup of speakers is fantastic as well, particularly on the question of COVID, which I know you've got Rob Wallace who spoke earlier, and you've got Mike Davies, and you've got Ian Angus. So in my contribution here, I want to concentrate not on how the COVID pathogens and others arrived across the world, but what the impact has been on the world economy and on lives and livelihoods, in particular, of working people around the world. To do that, I just want to cover this process by looking at a few graphs, as is my wont, so that you can see more clearly the arguments I'm going to make. So I'm just going to try and share that screen if I can. So here we go. Just to remind you where we are as of November the 29th, more or less, this is the latest figures on this impact of COVID on lives, nearly 1.5 million deaths to date, with 60 million cases. And you can see on this graph on the left-hand side that the daily new cases are still rising sharply. This goes back from June. So this is this great new winter wave that we've got at the moment. And you can see on the right that deaths per day are also rising fast at the moment. So at the moment, we are right in the middle of a second serious wave of the impact on lives, health around the world. And just to remind you too, that basically the governments of the world were totally unprepared or unwilling to be prepared for this situation that had arose and started last January and spread across the world. Last September, just over a year ago, the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, which is a UN body, presented its annual report on the risk from global pandemics. They set this board up some time ago, and every year they report. And they reported to the world that there seems to be a complete lack of political will at all levels amongst national leaders to do anything about the dangers of rising emergence of new pandemics. They weren't getting their health systems ready. They were not devoting enough energy and resources to doing that. And they warned governments in September 2019 that they should be prepared and ready. Of course, there was no attempt to be prepared for the spread of this virus. At the same time, in terms of medical terms, the big pharmaceutical companies, big private pharmaceutical companies, had done no research and efforts to produce vaccines and other medical treatments to deal with these various viruses which are already developed over the past period. Out of the 18 largest US pharmaceutical companies, 15 had totally abandoned the field for antivirals and antibiotics. They're much more interested in heart medicines, tranquilizers, and other things which are profit leaders, and they had no interest in looking at hospital infections, emergent diseases, or tropical killers. So, and the universal vaccine for influenza, which there is on an annual basis, they could have developed one which was 100% effective if they'd been working in this area. Again, no money in that. So we are left with an annual vaccine which is only 50% effective. Now we can see the picture as a result of that. Here is an estimate of the various deaths per million in different countries across the world. You can see to the left, it's mainly European countries, but Brazil and the US up there as well. And you see particularly that the UK, of the large countries in the world, is third highest in deaths per million. And if you go to the right-hand side, you can see that we've got also European countries that have done a lot better, like Germany, and outside the scale here in Asia, countries like Taiwan, Korea, New Zealand, and of course China have got very, very low deaths per million at the moment, compared to the major G7 economies around the world, which have been hit badly and have not been able to cope with this COVID. Part of the reason is hospital beds per thousand. A dramatic reduction over the last 20 or 30 years in hospital beds availability, reduction in medical resources, privatizations of medical systems and health systems has meant that basically the many health systems around the world can barely cope with normal activity in winter. There is no extra resources to deal with the result of a huge COVID pandemic sweeping across, as we found out when hospitals were overloaded in Europe and other countries in the first wave. And in the second wave, that is also beginning to appear. Just note where the UK is in terms of hospitals per bed, beds per thousand. Down here you can see Sweden down here, the US down here, and so on, are down with many of the poorest countries of the world. The best organized in hospital beds are Japan, Korea, Germany, and so on. Even China, which is still a relatively poor country, is a hell of a sight better than most European countries. That's an indication of how the health systems have been decimated and unable to cope. And now we have this winter wave, as I've shown before, a huge rise in cases per million and fatalities per million in the US and Western Europe as it sweeps back. So back in March, governments were forced, because they didn't have health systems that could cope, they didn't have any medical treatments to deal with these viruses, they weren't able to introduce sufficient socialization and test and tracing of people who might have it, and so they were forced into a series of severe lockdowns in order to try and control the virus and its impact. The result of the lockdown, of course, is that businesses closed, particularly leisure and service businesses, but also some manufacturing, travel companies, airlines, and so on. A massive lockdown in production, which hit the world dramatically. And the pandemic, you can see, here is the relative strength of the economies, of the advanced economies and the emerging economies in previous years. And just before the pandemic had hit, it was going through a brief boom, but gradually coming to an end. And then we can see that it falls off. By 2019, there's been quite a slowdown, but then we have a complete fall in production down to something like 25% below pandemic levels in the global economy. 90-odd%, 93% of all the countries in the world enter a slump. That's never been seen before. Even in the 1930s, we never had that many percentage of countries around the world going into the slump. 1930s depression had one which was down about, oops, you can see down here at about 80%, but now it's over 90%. Even the Great Recession didn't have that level of countries involved in a slump. So this is the severest slump in over 100 years at least, if not more, that we've seen in the world economy as a result of the pandemic lockdowns. A massive reduction in employment for vast numbers of people in all sorts of countries. Anything between 25 to 30% of workers have been laid off, furloughed, or just made unemployed. This is a dramatic fall. And in particular, it's hit emerging economies, so-called emerging economies. That's the poorest countries in the world that are called developing economies sometimes by the World Bank. And for the first time since records began measuring the economic output of these countries on average, we're seeing a negative growth. In other words, there's a contraction in the economies of the developing economies. And that's serious because they're the poorest in the world. And this average, by the way, that you can see has entered negative territory, includes China and India, who grew during the Great Recession at some rate. On this occasion, they've also been forced into a slump. And this means dramatic poverty for the vast majority of the population around the world. Nearly 4 billion people at the moment live on less than $5 a day. That's the real level of poverty that exists around the world, even before this pandemic. And now this pandemic is driving 150 million extra children into poverty areas. 188 countries have had to impose school closures, affecting 1.6 billion children and youth. And probably another million or so under 5 deaths could have occurred in the last 6 months as a result of the reductions in routine health service, which can no longer be carried out because of the COVID overflow. And many millions, hundreds of millions are going to go hungry in 2020, many of which are children. That's the situation that is developing as a result of the pandemic. Here is a measure of the collapse in GDP, which existed by the depth of the pandemic in the summer of this year. And you can see down the bottom there that Spain has had the sharpest drop in decline in GDP. But who's second in the whole of Europe? You can see that it's the UK that runs in second in the whole of Europe as a result of the pandemic lockdown. It's suffered the worst. In fact, we now can show that if we look at the top 7 countries, capitalist economies in the world, that the UK has had the largest contraction of something it will have by the end of the year, a contraction of just over 11%, which beats Italy, France, Canada, Germany, Japan, and the US having the lowest contraction, but all are contracting by significant margins than even compared to the Great Recession of 2008-9. And this has left a huge economic and social cost. This is a measure of the economic and the social cost to the US economy as a result of the pandemic. First, on the left-hand side, you can see the loss of GDP. Then you can see the loss of human beings, premature death of old people like me, who still have some way to go, who have been wiped out by this pandemic. And also long-term health impairment for people. I remind you, my son just talked to me yesterday. He said he thinks he had COVID last March. He had a few flu symptoms. But for the last 6 months, if he runs hard or does any energy, he has serious problems with his lungs. He feels out of breath really badly. He can't seem to break that away. That's the sort of long-term health impairment we're getting. And then there's mental health impairment. People suffering from being locked up, socially isolated, and so on. You can actually measure this economically, and that's what has been done by these economists here. So that it's really adding up to something like 3/4 of US annual GDP this year. The loss of incomes, the loss of people's lives and their contributions to society, and the loss of their happiness and so on. Now, can we get out of this? The question posed by this seminar is capitalism going to survive the pandemic? Well, the first thing to say is it's not going to survive and get out of this very quickly. My argument is, the argument of the optimists is that very quickly economies will bounce back. We've got the vaccines coming, the rates will finally go down, then we'll be able to jump back. One economist said it's a bit like in the resorts, summer resorts in North America and Europe. In the winter, they all close down and it's like it's dead as a doornail. But then when summer comes, they all open up and sprout forward again as though nothing had happened. And some argue that that's how the world economy is going to operate. Well, I don't think so. Because, as I say, 90% of the world economies have been contracting with a global recession, and that's unprecedented, the synchronization. So if one country starts growing, the others still aren't growing, then it's very difficult for it to recover, to trade, to expand. The major slump in world trade means that with the synchronized and integrated nature of trade and investment around the world, you need a synchronized recovery. That seems extremely unlikely. You've got countries like China, which are recovering, but nobody else. So China's growth recovery is going to be limited while everybody else stays where they are. But even before this pandemic, productive investment per head and profitability were at real lows. And we can see that it's been a steady decline in global growth over the last 10 years in particular, but even longer than that. So already the capitalist economy worldwide was sick, not very healthy. The pandemic slump makes it extremely difficult then for it to come out. When you're feeling unwell already, it's very difficult to recover. Also, there's been a huge increase in debt in order to overcome and ameliorate this slump. Not only has governments borrowed huge amounts of money to bail out banks and companies and provide some basic paycheck support for working people, but also the private sector has dramatically taken on more loans in order to survive and get through this pandemic. And that debt is going to haunt these companies when they try to come back and revive again. As you can see, there's a dramatic drop in private investment to GDP over the last 40 years, and that's has weakened the capitalist economy. And here you can see that the profitability of capitalist companies around the world is very, very low. You can see that on this measurement, it's probably at the lowest it's been since the 1980s at the moment, before we entered this pandemic. And so this pandemic makes it very difficult when you've got low profitability on your productive investment to be in a position to recover quickly. And as I say, global debt has dramatically increased, and that weighs as a burden upon capitalist economies. And perhaps even more important, as I was saying before, world trade growth has dramatically fallen. Where it was growing before the Great Recession of about 6% a year, faster than annual output in the world, now it's even before the pandemic, it was growing at just 2% a year, which is much slower than world growth at that time. So there's no escape. You can't look to export your products or trade in order to get out of this crisis because there's no trade that's happening sufficiently. And now with the pandemic driving everybody way down to these ridiculously low levels, slump in trade of 15% plus, where even if that recovers, it doesn't provide much support for growth. And as I said before, in a way, the recession was already coming before we got to the pandemic. In fact, global profits were contracting just before we got to the pandemic. So on that basis, there was no possibility of a fast expansion and recovery. And now from the pandemic, just like some people are suffering long-lasting effects from COVID, so the world economy will suffer long-lasting effects from the COVID. The economies that manage to contain the virus quickest and best, either through lockdowns, test and trace, better health systems, are able to come out of this slump much more quickly. This is a graph. On the left-hand side shows the deaths per million so far. You can see the UK and Spain down here, China and Taiwan up there. So you have less deaths per million. You actually have a better chance of growing. So China's growing, Vietnam's growing. These countries are moving along to grow in 2021. While if you're over here, your chances of getting over to the right-hand side of this graph are going to be much less. So it's an argument against. If we had no lockdowns, the economies would be better. No. If the quicker you can contain the virus, either by lockdowns or by other socialization, and by test and trace, then the quicker you can come out of this crisis. The more you have opened up lockdowns and not controlled them, the less likely you're going to get out of the crisis. Only China has had a V-shaped recovery. As you can see on the left here, that's world output. It's fallen down in 2020. That was the trajectory of growth in the world economy. It should be up here by next year if there'd been no COVID slump. In fact, it fell there and it's going to end up here, well short of where it was before. If that's the world as a whole. If you look on the other side, you can see that only China is having this V-shaped recovery, perhaps returning to its trajectory as before, down, then up, and then along the same trajectory. Everybody else, Europe, the US, nowhere near. They're not going to get anywhere near getting back to where they were before for years, if at all. And yet there's no end to the pandemic. So while the pandemic's not under control, there's no possibility of really recovery. We know that the vaccines are coming, but in the meantime, the mobility and economic activity, particularly in Europe, but also in other major economies, has gone slumping back again. You can see the big slump originally in the first wave of the pandemic, which was massive. It seemed that the economies were coming out of it, and now we've entered this winter pandemic. This line is going back down again. So the vaccines are coming. Well, maybe they are. Maybe they'll be in the first part of 2021, much quicker than expected. That raises certain alarms that maybe they're not safe or fully effective as they claim, but we shall see. Health systems, however, remain underfunded and inadequate to deal with the situation. Can we distribute these vaccines to everybody quickly enough, particularly to the global south, which doesn't have the facilities to do that? Is there any international cooperation plan to ensure that will happen? Above all, is there anything going to be done about why the vaccines are necessary? Why we had these pathogens in the first place, like the expansion of fossil fuel exploration, industrial farming, so on. There's no end in sight. We could have more pandemics that are coming through at the moment. So we've had a permanent loss in production as a result of the pandemic. See this blue area? This area is never coming back. That's lost to the world in terms of livelihoods and improvements in our conditions and so on, gone forever. And the trade situation similarly remains in a really bad way. There is no possibility of a return, in my view, to pre-pandemic levels. We're going to drag along here on this blue line instead of this red line, which is what was happening before, or similarly with the US on the right. Marx once said that the way in which you get out of a crisis under capitalism, how they survive this pandemic, is by causing the destruction of capital. What do we mean by that? Well, that means closing down inefficient companies. It means reducing the labor force, getting rid of the labor force, reducing costs. It means the companies that survive introduce new technology, which means they don't have to use so much labor. They suck up the market share of the weaker companies, and then on that basis, they can increase profitability. So the slump creates the conditions for an increase in production afterwards. So that it's a boom and slump process, that V shape we're talking about. Joseph Schumpeter, who was a mainstream economist of the 1930s, said we could call it creative destruction. How capitalism works, it destroys what we've done before and our livelihoods in order to create the conditions for a new development. But this seems to be very unlikely this is going to happen this time because of the huge amount of debt that's been built up to keep so many companies going. I know Joseph's going to talk about this, so I won't go much further on that. But simply to say, there is a whole thousands and thousands of companies out there that are just surviving by covering, not even being able to cover the interest on their debt, are surviving partly from government handouts, but not really having enough funding to even expand, let alone continue to survive. So you can see this huge increase in what is called zombie companies here in this year as a result of the pandemic. That's another block for capitalism surviving this pandemic and coming out of it quickly. Bankruptcies are therefore going to be on the rise. I'll finish up on this chair just to make this point, that one, this pandemic began with a production shock, a collapse in supply, closing of factories. Then it was a consumption shock. People couldn't spend any money, they were locked at home, or they didn't want to travel, or they were made unemployed, so there was a spending shock. Next year, there is a real danger we shall have a financial shock, a financial crash with all these companies going bankrupt, not returning, and banks finding they've got huge debts which will have to be bailed out by governments. That remains to be seen, but that's the real danger in 2021. Antonio Guterres is the UN Secretary General. He recently made a really good, important speech where he said the world economy was at a breaking point, if we're talking about survival. He said, the pandemic is like an X-ray. It's revealed all the fractures in the fragile skeleton of our societies that we've built. It's exposed fallacies and falsehoods everywhere. What are those fallacies? The lie that free markets can deliver healthcare for all. This is Antonio Guterres, the UN General Secretary. The fiction that unpaid care work in homes, and that including paid care work for that matter, is not really work that matters. We now know how important that is. The delusion that we live in a post-racist world, says Antonio Guterres. Well, the experience of the last year has demonstrated the nature of this racist world, both in the US and elsewhere, whether it's in France this last week, or whether it's been in the US with Black Lives Matter. And the myth that we're all in the same boat, well, there's a joke. The bailouts for the big companies and the banks and the rich has been maintained. Their living standards have hardly been hit. The stock market is at record highs. And yet there are millions and millions of people in the advanced capitalist world out of work with no prospects of ever coming back to work in 2021. And of course, as I showed you, hundreds of millions in the so-called global south. So Guterres says it's time to decide, are we going to succumb to chaos, division, inequality? So he's appealing to the capitalist leaders. Are we going to survive this? Are you going to succumb to this? Or will we do something about righting the wrongs of the past and moving forward? Well, I think we know the answer that will come from the global leaders around the world. They will do nothing to sort this out except in their own interests. And yet we have some major challenges ahead for global capitalism that existed before the pandemic. Rising inequality of income and wealth. What is being done about that? The graph on here shows the US inequality rising for the increase in the share for the top 1% and even less. Poverty, 3.4 billion people, as I said, nearly half the world on less than £5.50 a day, a number that's barely declined since 1990, according to the UN Special Rapporteur. Global warming and climate change, 1 in 5 chance that in the next 5 years will be over that Paris Agreement limit of 1.5% warmth. So there'll be no control. We will have not been able to control global warming and climate change as a result. And the environmental destruction that has been going on, which will result in yet more pandemics. And above all, perhaps in terms of economic situation in the 21st century, the growing international tensions between the US and China that are going to get worse over the next 10 or 15 years, and the pandemic has added to that. We need, in my view, to reset the economy. We need to change it from a socialist point of view. We need a different approach. We need a global plan for full employment, for jobs that are living wage, and including those people who are not working or cannot work. We need public investment in infrastructure and services like health, education, housing, transport, communications. These could all be free at the point of use if we devoted our resources to doing that and organised our taxation and ownership situations such that we made those things free rather than having to be paid for. Investment is in harmony with nature and the planet. You've been discussing that this weekend and more. How serious it is. The fossil fuel industry must be phased out if we're to have control over this. Cancelling the debts of the poorest countries exploited by the multinationals of the imperialist countries. They're in serious trouble at the moment, with many countries beginning to default on their debts. And yet the IMF and the World Bank has done little or nothing to solve this issue. And then the tax havens for the rich and powerful. Nearly 10% of annual GDP in the world, which should be government revenues, is being salted away by the rich and the big multinationals into tax havens where they pay no tax. And also the very richest people, we should pay much more tax. There is no progressive taxation system. It's been abolished basically in the major economies. And in my view, we can't do anything without, on a world plan, without having public ownership of the major institutions and the banks and institutions, the multinationals, so that we can plan the world democratically for social objectives and not for the profit of a few owners of capital. That is the way forward in my view. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that brilliant introduction, Michael. So now we're going to bring in Joseph.
Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see that, Chair? Just give me a nod if, yeah, fantastic, thank you. Well, let me first of all say that in a literal sense, capitalism will survive the pandemic. That's not really the point. The point is that we have to recognize how high the stakes have been raised by the pandemic. What we're beginning to see is elements of the capitalist system and its ability to reproduce itself breaking down. And unless the billions of workers and oppressed people across the world can develop a collective response to this that transforms the system, what we're going to see in the coming years is an incremental shift towards barbarism. You know, the old slogan, socialism or barbarism, used to be very abstract. It's becoming less and less abstract in this context. So that's how high the stakes are in this situation. Of course, that doesn't mean capitalism is going to collapse overnight, but we have to understand the challenges facing us. In the pages of International Socialism, I've described what's happening in 2020 as a triple crisis. What I mean by that is, first of all, that there are two long-term tendencies here. First of all, we have the ecological crisis, and secondly, we have what Michael Roberts and myself have called the long depression. And it's very clear that these two long-term processes are now feeding one another. So the long depression is rooted above all in a long period of low profitability, and it pushes capital to make ever deeper incursions into fragile ecosystems to try to extract profits. On the other hand, the ecological crisis that's developing is further driving the conditions in which it's harder for capital to reproduce itself, for example, through catastrophic climate change or the new kinds of weather patterns or changes in food production that it's driving. And out of this ecological crisis, we see the third dimension of the crisis emerge this year, the pandemic crisis. And what the pandemic does is it draws together both of these longer term factors in an extremely stark manner. The virus itself, like most pandemic diseases, emerges from animal populations into human society through capital's penetration, destruction, and commodification of nature. And as it emerges, it simultaneously shuts down both supply and demand in the economy, and it acts as a detonator for the latest phase in this long depressive period of capitalism. So it links together the two elements of this long-term crisis. And we're going to see more and more crises of this kind, I think, in the coming years. What I'm going to focus my remarks on, really for the next 10, 15 minutes, is I want to look in more detail at the nature of this long depression, which forms a context for what Michael Roberts and myself are talking about. But I think it's very important in talking about this, we keep at the back of our minds, it's not purely an economic crisis. The ecological crisis is now an irreducible element of it. Okay, so the crisis itself, Marx pointed out a very long time ago that capitalism rests on this endless circuit of production and exchange that must be repeated again and again by capitalism on an ever-expanding scale. Capitalism must produce, it produces commodities, but it also produces profits for the capitalist. But it must, as well as producing, take goods and services to market, sell them, purchase raw materials, machinery, and so on, and engage in another cycle. And as I say, this takes place on an ever-expanding scale within capitalism. And as Marx points out, whenever this circuit breaks down for whatever reason, a crisis emerges. It's this circuit of capital that creates the objective conditions in which crisis becomes a possibility. In the current crisis in 2020, as Michael Roberts suggested, it's rather unusual in the sense that the circuit broke down simultaneously at 2 points. It broke down in the sphere of production, because networks of production began to shut down as the pandemic took hold, but it also broke down in the sphere of the market as both consumers and capitalists ceased buying commodities in the market. So you have this simultaneous collapse of production and a collapse in demand. But if we look a little bit lower below the surface of the capitalist system, as well as seeing the sort of imminent possibility of crisis emerging, we can look at the factors that drive the system again and again into crisis at a more fundamental level. And there are two central drivers of crisis in Marx's analysis. The first one, which Michael Roberts has spoken about a lot in his book and blog and so on, and myself as well, is the long-term tendency for declining profitability. Now, Marx's explanation for this is very sophisticated, very thoroughgoing. You could read particularly the third volume of Capital and all the commentary that's been written about this if you want to get a deeper grip on it. What I'm going to give you is a very brief, unsophisticated, simplified explanation that I'm going to urge you to take on trust. And you can do the reading afterwards and see if I'm right or not. But the argument rests on Marx's contention that the value produced under capitalism reflects the amount of labor required under typical conditions to produce goods and services. So essentially, the whole new pool of value created by capitalism in a given period is determined by the amount of labor that's undertaken on average across that period. In other words, it's the duration, the hours of work performed by living labor. So this sets a limit for the amount of profit accessible to capital as a whole across the system, this work performed by 1 billion or so wage laborers, minus the amount that has to be paid to those wage laborers, which is less than the value that they create. So it's a total value production net of the amount paid in wages, the top half of this diagram that I'm showing you on the slides. But in order to access this pool of potential profit, capitalists have to purchase not just living labor, the labor of workers in the here and now, but they also have to purchase what Marx calls dead labor, machinery, equipment, plant, raw materials, and so on, which they pay for. They buy it off of the capitalists typically, and whose value then passes over into the finished product. And, you know, all else going well, they make neither a profit nor a loss on that dead labor, but they have to purchase it in order to engage in production. And unfortunately for capital, these purchases are mandatory because capitalism is a system of competition, and any unit of capital that doesn't engage in this kind of investment very rapidly gets driven to the wall. Now, moreover, what Marx identified is the tendency under capitalism is for the value of investment in dead labor to rise without limits, and certainly far more rapidly than investment in living labor, in hiring workers. And it's this that generates a downward pressure on profitability, which Michael Roberts showed in one of his graphs, and I'll show you my own, another version of that graph in a moment. Why this is important is that the rate of profit, the return on investment, governs the potential rate of future expansion. It governs how fast capitalists can invest in the future. And any decline in this rate of profit will place limits on that future investment and will begin to appear as an existential threat to the capitalist system as a whole. So it drives the system towards profit, towards crises of profitability. Now, the way the system resolves those crises of profitability, and I can be very brief on this because Michael Roberts already spoke about it, is it has to destroy and devalue capital. And it does this above all else in periods of crisis. So we look at the deepest crisis capitalism has hitherto entered, the long period of slump and war from 1929 through to 1945, the scale and extent of this crisis paves the way for the huge boom of the system in the 50s and 60s. So crisis and the destruction of capital can resolve this problem of profitability. Now, the second driver of crisis, alongside falling profitability, is what happens in the sphere of finance. Capitalism doesn't just expand with the internal resources of individual capitalists. They enter financial markets to engage in activities involving credit. And these chains of credit and debt push capital beyond its limits. They allow capitalists to expand with other people's money, to put it very, very crudely. And it creates these complex chains of credit and debt, which, you know, the debts are repaid if all goes well, out of retained profit, out of a share of the profits made by capital. And so you can run down these debts again. But what happens if things go badly and capitalists can't pay off their debts, or if there are some faltering of these chains of credit and debt? So what you see is credit pushing capital beyond its limits, but it then becomes a new fracture line in the capitalist system, generalizing crisis as debts turn bad and spreading crisis through the system, accelerating crisis and all the rest. And again, what resolves this problem? Well, a really big crisis can destroy some of the bad debts, removing some of the debt burden overhanging the capitalist system. Now, this is a very general account of crisis under capitalism, but what it leaves out, and what I want to talk about, is a really crucial point about how capitalism evolves historically. So these tendencies towards crisis, I would say, are inherent within the capitalist system, but the precise way that they play out in actually existing capitalism changes with the evolution of the capitalist system over the past few hundred years. And in particular, through the 20th and 21st centuries, what becomes more important are mechanisms of what I call crisis deferral. Now, when I say crisis deferral, what I mean is kicking the can further down the road. I don't mean that capitalism escapes the crisis tendency. Capitalism can't escape the crisis tendency. But what it can do very effectively is defer the crisis, storing up problems, which then re-emerge in new form further down the line. And it's these kind of deferral mechanisms that I want to look at. So if we look at the US economy, what we can identify, and what I've tried to show on this chart, is three distinct phases in the history of the US economy. And you can make similar cases for other economies, but they each follow slightly different tempos, and so it's easier to look at one particular economy. The first phase is really the early capitalism, which conforms quite closely to Marx's account of crisis, where you get very sharp booms of a system and equally sharp slumps, each slump paving the way for the next boom, and so on. Then in the post-war period, you get this new phase developing, where there are still booms and busts, but not of the same kind of magnitude. When we talk about the 50s and 60s being the golden age of capitalism, we're not necessarily saying the profit rate is the highest it's ever been, or even that the growth rate is the highest it's ever been. What we're talking about is a very sustained period of boom within the capitalist system, not interrupted by these very, very sharp slumps. Then this golden age of capitalism fades into the crisis period of the 70s and early 80s, and you get this turn towards neoliberal policies in the early 80s that begins, as Michael Roberts indicated in one of his graphs, to put a floor under the decline in profitability. And here we still have a pattern, a muted pattern of boom and bust compared to the pre-war period, but the rate of growth is now much more diminished. The tendency, though, is still for quite long periods of growth. People may remember about a year ago, Donald Trump boasting that the US economy had enjoyed its longest ever period of expansion. It's absolutely true, but it was a very, very weak expansion, a weak, long, stagnant period of expansion. So you have this developing tendency, which has its roots in the earlier post-war period, towards stagnation and ultimately towards what we are calling a long depression. And as the period develops, the stagnation is prone to periods not just of weak growth, but periods, I would say, of negative growth and crisis. Now, what explains this pattern? I think there are a number of things. I want to point to, I think, three of them. First of all, the system is composed of capitalist firms, real capitalist firms. It's not an abstract capitalist system, it's a real capitalist system made up of units of capital. And as the system ages, there's a tendency for these units of capital to grow in size. In a world of small firms and small banks, you can allow some of these firms to go under, helping to resolve the crisis by restoring profitability. In the post-war period, this becomes much more difficult. It becomes a system of what Michael Kidron, in his writings in the period, talked about as a sclerotic capitalist system, an aging but sickening capitalist system, the units of capital growing bigger and bigger. The system increasingly is dominated by giant firms, first operating mainly on the national terrain, but as the system ages further by the 80s and 90s, increasingly a world of global multinationals. There's a brief period in the 80s and early 90s where capitalist firms in America are getting smaller, but that's now being eclipsed by a return to this process of enlarging capitalist firms from the late 1990s, led by high-tech firms, internet firms like Amazon, financial firms, and to an extent by large-scale retail like Walmart. Walmart, by the way, the biggest firm in the world, has an annual turnover the same now as the GDP of Sweden, I think it is. Used to be Norway, but now it's Sweden. The second factor which underpins this tendency is that the state becomes a major player in the economy in the post-war period. And with the shift to neoliberalism, this is not reversed. The direction of state intervention is changed, but states still intervene in a huge way in the economy. In the 1950s and 60s, this meant primarily the diversion of expenditure away from capitalist investment towards state investment in unproductive forms of waste expenditure, if you like, arms expenditure and so on, which muted the decline of profitability for complicated reasons that Michael Kidron again talked about. What it means today, I think, more and more is a temptation for states, and very importantly for central banks, which are linked to states, to intervene in the economy, to defer crisis by stopping giant firms going under and putting a floor under this collapse in the economy through the expansion of credit and so on. What do we see as a result of this tendency? I'm aware that I'm going to run out of time quite soon, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. The first thing we see is that there's this long tendency for declining profitability, which is still a cyclical pattern. It still goes through up and down cycles all the way through, but increasingly it's also a secular long-term tendency towards decline in the post-war period. It's not straightforward up and down. There are long periods of declining profitability over multiple economic cycles. And this stabilizes in the early 1980s. You get, profits going up and down, but you get no return to the kind of profit levels you saw in the early 1950s, for example. So you don't get a boom on that kind of scale. Growth becomes increasingly weak, underpinned by low profitability. Secondly, credit is not simply something that pushes capital beyond its limits in any given cycle of expansion. It's a long-term phenomena. Credit expands over multiple cycles of capitalism, becoming a secular rise in credit, and credit becomes a thing that pushes capitalism in the long run. Ever more credit has to be created to maintain the expansion of capital. And it means we have a system built around asset price bubbles in the financial system, very different kinds of bubbles in different periods, underpinned by a mega bubble of credit, providing the dynamism of the capitalist system. And thirdly, as Michael Roberts indicated, a growth of zombie firms that recycle their debt, but they don't do very much else beyond that. This is the nature of contemporary capitalism. And it means that the nature of the capitalist system we find ourselves in is one in which the dynamic of this kind of long depression is reinforced with each successive cycle. So in 2000, 2001, the US economy entered a recession driven by the collapse of the dot-com bubble in high-tech shares, driven by the 9/11 attacks on America and so on. The response of the US Federal Reserve, the central bank, slash interest rates and create a new bubble in housing and mortgage origination. 2008, seven years on from this, that bubble in turn comes crashing down and you start to see a new crisis developing in America. What does the US Federal Reserve and the US government do? They intervene directly in the economy to bail out the system and again cut interest rates, engage in quantitative easing. And these measures are not just in the US, they're echoed in Britain, in Japan, across the Eurozone, and increasingly in China and the global South. I'll finish on these points. So you see not just credit expansion in the global North, but if you look at the lower graph, credit expansion in the global South as well, particularly in China, but in many other global South economies. And as the third crisis of the 21st century breaks, what do you see? Again, state intervention on an absolutely colossal scale. The top graph is the stimulus in 2008, 2009. The bottom graph is stimulus in this crisis in 2020. On an
Sorry, Joe, your audio has just went. Yeah, I don't know what's happened there. It seems to have cut out, Joe.
1 second.
There you go, I can hear it now.
Okay, you can hear me, you can't see me. That's a good combination. Sorry, let me just wrap up on this. Along with this, you get low interest rates. The system needs low interest rates. Interest rates have been cut in 2008. They went up a little bit in 2016, 2017. They've been slashed to the bone again. So what does this mean? My final point, it means that the prospects, even if capitalism recovers, are number one, further financial fragility as unstable flows of credit go into increasingly risky assets. It means a new round of very, very weak growth, unstable growth. It means poor job growth, as you're already seeing in the US and British economies. It means spending cuts, as we've heard from Rishi Sunak, as governments try to control debt levels. It means attacks on workers and the environment as firms try and maintain their profitability in conditions of relative stagnation. And it means a new crisis in 5 to 10 years' time. People used to ask, can the workers run society? The question we have to ask now is, can the capitalists run society? The system is failing more obviously than ever before. If ever there were a time for anti-capitalist politics and a revolutionary agenda, surely it's 2020. I'll finish there, thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much for both those excellent, thought-provoking, fascinating introductions. We've now got time for questions, comments, discussion. So if anyone hasn't been along to kind of a Zoom meeting before, if you just go down to the bottom of your screen and click on the participants button, you'll be able to see a little button there telling you to raise your hand. And if you do that, I'll be able to see you. There's kind of too many people in the room for you to all just wave frantically at me. If you have a comment as well but you don't want your video, your face on any recordings, just send a little wee message through to tech support. That's Rory, who's hiding behind tech support, and he'll be able to take out any video recordings. But yeah, if people just stick up their hands. Also, I'll tell people to wind up or stop at around 3 minutes. If people can try and keep their contributions to 2 to 3 minutes, just means we can get through some different voices in the room. I can see Craig, you have your hand up, so I'll bring in Craig.
Thank you. Yeah, so thanks for two great talks, really very, very interesting stuff there. Michael had talked about how governments have been unprepared or unwilling to be prepared to ready themselves for the impact that COVID was going to have, or for any pandemic was going to have. And also Joseph has mentioned the fact that risky assets attract more investment, but it's also the case that investment in general has been in a bit of a downward trend. In fact, we're talking about investment strikes not that long ago, because capital has been so unwilling to invest in anything. So yeah, you'll get some going into risky assets, and that'll burn up some capital. But as regards the decision-making process of the capitalists and the governments that work for them, do you see any trends as to what is starting to become the solution that they're going to choose? What are they going to invest in the medium to longer term, or well, actually shorter term even more so? Is there a trend? Because obviously we are extremely concerned about the nature of politics right now, but is that affecting economics as directly as we would think, or what do you see trend wise in terms of where are these necessary investments going to go?
Thanks for that, Craig. While people are kind of waiting to put their hands up, I can see that it's a question that Dave asked in the chat, which is a question for the speakers. We'll give the speakers a chance to come back at the end. So if other people want to contribute to it, they're more than welcome. The question was, Aaron said capitalism could survive as long as working class people pay the price. Do the speakers still think that this applies? So the extent to which massive programs of austerity, how much can that bail out the capitalists or ameliorate the crisis from their perspective? I can see Rebecca has her hand up. I'll call you Rebecca, but I also just encourage people. I think people can feel intimidated in meetings that are about the economy, but I think this is a room full of people who are all trying to grapple with the crisis that the capitalists have helped create and figure out a way after it. So if you have a weak question, you have a comment you think is maybe a bit silly, it's probably not. It's probably a million times better than a lot of the discussions that people end up having about, what's going on today. So people shouldn't feel kind of reticent to just stick their hand up, but I'll bring in Rebecca.
Thanks, Jade. Yes, both great to hear from the speakers. Good to have some visuals as well. I'm not really a math person, but I think it's one of the things, especially coming in and looking at revolutionary politics, you really want to kind of understand how economics could be different, because we're brought up in a time of crisis where it was kind of constantly like, oh no, what's going to happen? Are you going to be able to get a job? Are you going to be able to support yourself in the future? So I like to think that there's hope there. But what I find interesting is especially hearing about capitalism, getting to understand a bit of the context. You have feudalism, moving on to capitalism, and it's allowed us to kind of engage in our kind of industrial revolution, etc. It's allowed society to expand and the human race to kind of invest in technology and in themselves and education and innovate. But that seems that the time for capitalism is coming to an end. I'm just wondering if there's a kind of consensus, or among some economics, if there's a sort of understanding in the wider economic world that capitalism is failing, because it seems like common sense. Maybe I'm biased, but it's starting to seem like capitalism is no longer the answer, and I'm wondering if the mass people feel are discussing that. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you for that, Rebecca. I'll bring you in, Anne. Anne, you're just still muted at the moment.
Thanks very much. Two fantastic talks, Michael and Joseph. Thanks very much. Again, it's really a couple of questions, I'm afraid. During the 2008 crisis, a large part of the rescue for that was provided by the central banks in different countries, which were prepared to spend billions of trillions to bail out the banks, the other banks and so on. So the first question is really, to what extent are the central banks capable of playing that same role in the current crisis? Can they play the role now that they played in 2008? And if not, what might be some of the implications of that in terms of the collapse of some of the very, very big banks and big companies that Joseph was talking about? The second question is really about China, because I think, you know, we in the international socialist tradition have long argued that China is not socialist, but is a form of state capitalism. But clearly, and clearly the basis of the expansion of China in recent decades has also been based on the exploitation of workers, no less than in the West. But clearly, to some extent, China seems to have been able to overcome both the worst effects of the 2008 recession and, as both speakers have emphasised, is emerging more quickly out of the current pandemic. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the basis of China's expansion at the present time and the extent to which China can play a role globally in helping the system to recover from the current crisis.
Thanks, Ian. Just before I call the next speaker, I'll just read out, there's another question that's been raised in the chat, which is about, are there other Marxist explanations for crisis, and are they right or wrong? You know, what makes them inadequate? But Dave, I'll call you in.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, at the start of the 20th century, Lenin described it as a period that was developing of wars and revolutions. And I think it's getting like that in the period we're in now. First of all, the point that Michael made, that this is the most global crisis. When he showed his graphs, he showed how almost in concert across the globe, every economy was in slump in a way that it wasn't even in the 1930s, the last, you know, the great crash. And also given the global growth of the working class. I mean, when Lenin was writing, the working class in Russia was tiny, but it was tiny comparative globally to what it is today. Then, and look at, I was listening to the meeting I was on last night, at the meeting that Charlie Kimber did about the global the revolts that are happening right across the globe, increasing. Not just Black Lives Matter or, you know, that, but actual revolts in places like Nigeria, Africa, the Far East. I think we're entering a period like that again. But what it requires is the SWP is part of an international tendency, international socialist tendency. The whole question of organisation internationally becomes more and more important in building organisation of organised revolutionaries that not only operate in Scotland or England, but right across the globe. What are the signs of that? I see encouraging signs in America, a growth of socialist ideas, especially among young people. We see it here as well. Even although we're in lockdown, the number of people that are turning towards Marxist ideas and socialist ideas. I wonder if both of the speakers would like, or either of the speakers would like to comment on that and how they see that developing, what their knowledge of it is. Okay.
Thanks, Dave. Jessica, would you like to unmute yourself and come in?
Thanks, Jade. And thanks so much to the speakers. I thought it was a really useful meeting. I think especially kind of framing the crisis that we're experiencing as this interplay between a deepening economic crisis and that feeds into a deepening ecological crisis and how those two interplay. I don't know if people have seen, and I think it's especially useful to talk about how the pandemic is not going to be the last kind of pandemic that we're going to experience. In the news this week, there's we've seen a bird flu that's causing kind of swans to drop dead across the UK, really horrific, like bleeding from their nostrils and spinning around. This has now gotten into capitalist turkey farms in the UK, and they're having to cull thousands of turkeys to try and get on top of this thing. And I think this this just shows us that that pandemic production is not, you know, you can see people dismissing like COVID-19 as, oh, it's like a weird thing that happened in China. We don't have to really think about why it happened or where it come from. And yeah, we really have to talk about where and why these pandemics are emerging. And it's, I think the speakers lined out quite well how it's from within the system, within its own productive mechanisms, that it penetrates into nature, commodifies wild animals, which produces these disastrous outcomes. And then, of course, the climate change is the biggest kind of expression of that. And then, yeah, the economic crisis. Like, yeah, if you're my age, you know, we've or younger, we've been experiencing economic crisis for like most of our adult lives, and I think like it's really important to talk about that underlying problem of profitability, because I think you hear a lot right now about like kind of financialization. You know, the problem is just with bankers, the greedy bankers, the debt. But I think the implication of this is that if we can curb finance, so we can curb debt, then you know, we'll be able to have a better system. But I think Joseph and Michael showed quite well that actually this growth of debt is being pushed forward by the dynamics of the system. These bankers are being that system that's growing up is because of the dynamics of low profitability, and actually that finance has been used to stop these massive crises from occurring, kicking the can down the road, etc., by bailing out the banks and putting a floor under this crisis, but that doing nothing to fix the actual health of the economy. And it's only through, you know, destruction of these massive firms, these unprofitable firms, getting rid of lots of huge debt, that it would be able to return to growth. But I mean, that means that we'll have to go through a major recession in order for the system to enjoy rebound and profitability, which we know that working class people will be made to pay for, being thrown out of work, thrown into poverty, etc., etc. So obviously, I think, you know, our conclusion has to be that we have to rip up the whole system that creates this crisis, that makes working class people have to pay for it. And yeah, we have to look forward to those kind of movements. Like, you know, we've seen the people of Guatemala being forced, you know, they're facing cuts to education and public services, and they've, you know, risen up and burnt their parliament. And that's the kind of force we have to look for in order to fight this. That's me.
Thanks, Jessica. Duncan, did you want to contribute?
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks very much to the speakers. What I want to say something about, and you know, form a couple of questions is, obviously the UK is leaving the EU, and I was wondering what impact that will have, if any, on the attempts of, say, the European Central Bank to stabilize the block of European capital. You might imagine that, say, you know, the UK leaving would strengthen German capital and French capital within the EU bloc. Is that the case? Or will it just create more instability and add to the instability of the background of the falling rate of profit historically? What impact will it have, if any, on the attempt to, if you like, stabilize the capitalist system as a whole? Thank you.
Thanks, Duncan. Fu, did you want to come in? I think. Fu, did you want to contribute? You're unmuted. Well, why don't we bring in Eric while we wait to see.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Both presentations very useful in confirming, explaining the underlying problems in debt and profitability that mean it will be a V-shaped recovery, and how these are like other. But I have questions more about the specific, you know, why this one is different, the COVID, and why it's looking different. I mean, you see, the world's billionaires have reached a new high, you know, 10.2 trillion over the past couple of years, but especially happening under coronavirus. You know, you're a record number of billionaires now across the world. World Bank saying this is going to push 150 million worldwide into extreme poverty. They're already very low idea of extreme poverty. The COVID recession is doing this. And more of them are urban, better educated, less likely to work in agriculture than those in extreme poverty before. And here in the United States, it's the most unequal recession they've seen. You know, low-wage jobs were lost at 8 times the rate of high-wage jobs. Whereas in 2008, in the Great Recession, even the Forbes 400 richest people, it took them years to recover those losses. But now you see, you know, people, the guy who owns Quicken Loans, you know, it's gone from 7 billion to 43 billion. You see the Musk of Telsa and Bezos of Amazon. You know, Bezos has had 74 billion added to his wealth in just this year. And you got I guess, what are the figures were new wealth of American billionaires since March, they've added 100 trillion to their wealth. So is this some kind of permanent shift from one sector of the economy to the other, from small businesses towards the biggest? But there's a kind of a too big to fail that's wrapped up in this. And you could say a lot of that gains is in stock market fictitious capital, but it's you know, they're using it. They're making the political contributions from it. They're buying their greenhouse bunkers, and they're, you know, establishing themselves as a look, we're the people who drive the economy. You know, things have to be run to keep us going. How this does seem different from what's happened to the you know, much more unequal and that kind of growth at the top that's happened in other recessions. So how can that be explained, and what difference does that make?
Thanks, Eric. Fuong, did you want to come in? You're unmuted now. Oh no. If you just leave it, I think the tech team can unmute you.
Hi. Oh, look, I have a couple of questions really, which is that many years ago, I had the privilege of being heckled by Cliff at a meeting when I said that I thought that Western capitalism was, you know, inherently superior to the Soviet bloc. So are we now stuck in a mode because of the collapse of the Soviet Union that we think that the, you know, state investment is necessarily inferior? Okay, so that's because I don't think it is, and so my two questions really. I don't think it has to be, because Michael Roberts has, you know, questioned, you know, the idea that, you know, China's growth cannot continue. So how much can the state defer crisis? Because state investment is not a recent thing. If people look at it, the city of Shenzhen was built up entirely by state investment intervening in the world economy. People mustn't think that it's because, you know, the market, you know, developed Shenzhen and, you know, was the market that, you know, brought China to the 21st century and things like that. So the question I have is that just before the pandemic came, you know, I remember Joseph saying that, you know, the growth in India, the growth in the BRICS, but this time after the pandemic, why is it that China has been able to grow, you know, in the V shape again? And then my second question, which is this, is my observation is China is moving, you know, opening up its markets and credits completely. In 2014, Hong Kong built a tunnel, a financial tunnel from Hong Kong to London. In 2019, this time, despite all the struggles in Hong Kong, the you know, Standard & Poor and Moody, its credit rating of Hong Kong did not fall at all, and they built a financial tunnel from Shanghai to Hong Kong. So it's linked now, okay? So my second question is this because of the successes of state investment in China coming up to a, if you like, you know, a limit, and that the Chinese ruling class is thinking we need to expand further into credit? Now, for the Western capitalists, they really, really want to go into China, because from what I understand, China has got the greatest savings and potential for making money in the whole world at the moment. It's like, a resource of gold, which is so far untapped because of, the high level of savings. Thank you.
Thanks, Vu. So we are kind of quickly getting to the end of our allocated time. So I'm going to call the last two people who had their hands up, which was Hector and then Donnie. And I'll also just mention, if people hadn't seen them, there's been a couple more questions about China in the chat, one of which kind of focuses about China, the fact that China has dealt with the crisis well, or better seemingly, than places like the UK or the EU, what that means for imperialist rivalries and imperialist positioning in the world. And the second question, which is about the class antagonisms that exist in China and what's politically developing there. So if either of the final two speakers want to touch on that, you definitely can, but also hopefully we can defer some of that to our speakers coming back at the end. So Hector and then Donnie.
Thanks, Jade, and thanks to the speakers. Look, it's been 2 days of great discussion at Marxism in Scotland. The theme of this year's event is socialism or barbarism. And this question posed in many different ways, which other sessions have explored. The question of pandemics, the rise of the far right, war, the climate emergency. It also takes the form of economic crisis and how this is exacerbating and accelerating all the other contradictions of capitalism. Think, for example, about the way in which the crisis is providing our rulers with an excuse not to take the action that is urgently needed on climate, or accelerating the imperialist rivalry among the US, China, and other powers. Look, as the speakers have said, there's nothing inevitable about capitalism collapsing, however deep the crisis is. If there's one thing we know about capitalism, is that it's an incredibly resilient and adaptable system that has changed throughout decades and survived, many serious challenges to the system. What is clear at the same time is that capitalism is pushing people to fight against it in the way that it always does. Dave Sherry spoke about the wave of revolts that we have seen across the world in the last couple of years. And whether it is Sudan or Chile or Lebanon or so many other places, in all these countries, we see the same underlying conditions pushing people to rise up and fight. The long stagnation or deterioration of living standards, the lack of prospects for young people and others, and the wider consequences of 40 years of neoliberal reforms. Capitalism is increasingly a system that demands more and more of people and gives less and less in return. It's also the case in all these countries, mostly in the global south, that they have undergone a very fast process of urbanization and proletarization in the last decades, meaning that virtually now in every country across the world, the working class is a sizable force that can put forward its own demands and take collective action to fight for them. Karl Marx said that capitalism creates its own gravedigger. And it is the case that the global working class today is bigger than it has been ever in history. Now, what that means, I think, is that the dynamic of boom and slump is built into capitalism and into its logic. But in itself, this is not going to lead to the system abolishing itself. The levels of organization and confidence and self-activity of those billions of people who make up the working class, that's what can overcome the system. At the beginning of the pandemic, 91% of people in Britain said in polls that they didn't want to go back to normal after the pandemic. We are the people who mean it when we say that we don't want to go back to normal. So if you have enjoyed the event so far, think about joining a revolutionary organization that doesn't want to tinker around the corners of the system and give neoliberalism a human face. Join the Socialist Workers Party, an organization that wants to completely overcome the system and fight for an alternative to barbarism. Thank you, Jade.
Thanks, Hector. Donnie, did you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's a question, and it sort of looks at the state investment that Fu Wong was talking about in reverse. I mean, the most comparable crisis to what we're having now is the 1929 Wall Street crash and what followed, and capitalism found a way out through state action. It was Second World War. It was huge investment in arms and all the rest of it after the war. basically a complete waste because it didn't go back into the economy. It wasn't about investing in production, it was investing in nothing, investing in destruction in that sense. And so my question is that an option now? I mean, it's quite interesting that we read that there's been 1 million jobs lost, but the biggest corporate shutdown is Arcadia, which, Topshop, which is hardly, shaking things. And so in a sense, the question is about, are we facing a continuation of the furlough approach, which is that the state carries on bailing out zombie companies forever? Or are we facing is there the potential this time for there is nothing too big to lose to shut down, and actually you do see a mass destruction of capital? Can they carry on bailing the thing out forever? Or will we end up with a real mass destruction of capital that might be their way out? I mean, it's death for us. We're seeing that in their millions, but for them, is it a way out? So that's the question.
Thanks, Donny. Okay, great. I'm going to bring in our speakers now who have the unenviable job of trying to respond to those varied and massive questions. So I'm going to bring in Michael first, then Joseph. And if the speakers could speak for around 5 to 10 minutes, I know that's not enough time, but we will be able to continue the discussion after the session if people want to.
Well, thank you, Jade. I'd like to thank the questioners for providing such questions that would take about 3 or 4 sessions to cover. You have now asked me to reply to all those questions in 5 to 10 minutes. Probably 5 is probably all I'll probably get. And therefore, the answer to all the questions is I can't answer them in 5 minutes, but I will do the best to at least give a skim over some of the points that are being made. Craig asked, are we going to have a new round of investment after this pandemic slump, if and when it comes to an end, and in what areas? Well, as we've seen from both what Joseph has pointed out and what I presented in my graph, investment amongst the major capitalist economies has been declining, productive sectors of investment. So the recovery of the pandemic does depend on a new round of investment, perhaps back into the banks and finance, into climate change maybe, and to technology already. But will it be sufficient to restore a prosperous and sustained level of growth? As Joseph pointed out, it's a sustained level of growth that capitalism's got to achieve to develop the productive forces and enable living standards to improve insofar as workers can struggle to get them the profits off the capitalists that are a result. As far as I can see, there is little evidence that capitalism is in the position after this pandemic to have a fast growth in investment and as a result in output and therefore in incomes. As Donny said at the end, the Great Depression of the 1930s lasted a whole decade and was only really resolved by the fact that the major economies went to war with each other, and then we had a war economy, which enabled what happened in the war economy, and it's very important to understand, is it wasn't that the private sector then boomed with investment. Of course, they got war contracts and so on, but actually the state took over control of the capitalist economy. There was state investment, it was state control, state direction of what capitalists should invest in, whether it should be mainly, of course, in armaments in order to achieve victory in the war. So what that is a lesson for us to remember, that a war economy was in some way the way in which the capitalism came out of that crisis. It also tells me that a social economy, where the state is in control, where state owns the bulk of the means of production and can direct it and plan it, hopefully democratically to do so, in that way, you can begin to come out of the crisis on a sustained basis. But if it remains broadly in the hands of the private sector, of the major capitalist companies to decide how to invest and how much to invest, then there's little chance of seeing a sustained recovery. Because as we pointed out in our material, both Joseph and myself, the profitability for private capital is really low. And there's no sign that's going to improve. In fact, for a whole layer of companies, they're making so little profits that they can hardly cover the costs of servicing their existing debt. We all look at the very big companies, the FANGs that made huge amounts of money during this pandemic, like Amazon, Netflix and so on. But these are the very small minority, concentrated at the top. There's a whole thousands of companies across the board in the US and Europe and Japan and so on, who are struggling in this crisis and will continue to struggle because of the average level of profitability. So, as I think another comrade mentioned, we've got, Eric, I think it was, huge inequalities of billionaires, but it's inequalities of companies as well, between the tech and the very rich. We're not all in the same boat, and neither are all companies all in the same boat. So that makes it very difficult for capitalism to come out of this slump on a sustained basis. We're going to go into, as Joseph has argued, a further sluggish period of low growth, probably lower growth even than we've seen over the last 10 years on average, if and when they come out of this pandemic. So the argument that fiscal stimulus, which is the government's just spending more, most of that fiscal stimulus is just to keep companies alive and to keep workers from starving, but that's all that's been done so far. It's not on the basis of really expanding the productive sectors of the economy, because it would just be too little. There won't be enough of that money while the capitalists remain in control of their means of production and activity. So fiscal spending won't be enough. The central banks, all they will do is, if they keep interest rates down, is actually enable borrowing to be cheap. Much of that borrowing is either being hoarded in cash funds or going into the stock market and into the bond market for speculation. It's not coming, it won't come into the productive sectors on the whole of the major economy, so they won't see any substantial recovery and sustained growth that Joseph is talking about out of this. Is China different? Well, it's a big subject, but it's not time to discuss. All I would say is that China is different in the sense that its state investment isn't a minority part of the economy. It's a dominant part of the economy. In this COVID pandemic slump, it's particularly the case. The private sector, which is large in, the capitalist sector is large in China, has slumped really badly, just like in the West. It's got very low profitability, it's gone negative. The state sector has been able to compensate for that by a dramatic increase. Two factors have driven China ahead of everybody else. First, a very effective lockdown, because they can autocratically and dictatorially apply it. Good health systems, good test and trace, using state health systems and activity, a concentration of the government in the direction where it matters, not leaving it up to the capitalist sector, plus state investment to recover from that slump. So that's made China different. Can China save the rest of the capitalist world? No, of course it can't. It's still way too small. Its labor productivity is no more than about 20% or 25% of the US labor productivity. It's still a relatively poorly developed economy. It's taken millions, hundreds of millions out of what we would call poverty in the global South through its progress over the last 30, 40 years. But it is still not a modern, sophisticated economy like the G7 is. It's still got a long way to go there, but it is catching up fast. And that's what frightens American imperialism in particular. I think it was Dave who pointed out what Lenin said 100 years ago about a dominant group of imperialist companies and countries controlling the world. That is still the case. Nothing has changed. I've done recent work on this to show that the top imperialist countries in 1915, when Lenin wrote Imperialism, are exactly the same as they are now. And there's no other countries really that have caught up except a few tiny city-states in East Asia. And China is still way short of that. It's still under the threat of imperialist domination, which it's protected itself from mostly, and as a result, it now threatens imperialism, which is why we're going to see an intense rivalry, possibly leading to political and military conflict over the next decade or so as a result of that. So Eric is right, imperialism hasn't gone away, and the result of imperialism is often wars, and that hasn't gone away as well. Can capitalism get out of this crisis and grow on a sustained basis? Only either through war, which hopefully will be revived, but alternatively through a significant number of slumps that are still to come, which can cause that creative destruction and change the picture of the profitability whoever is left. But we haven't reached that point yet, so we're going to go into another sluggish period of after this pandemic, with every prospect of further pandemics, as some comrades have pointed out, which will make it even more difficult. And I'll finish, Chair, remind comrades what I said at the end of my presentation, that there are major challenges ahead for capitalism as they come out of this pandemic. Climate change has not been resolved. The huge inequalities have not been resolved. We can only increase social tensions within countries as well. The rise of robots and automation means that there's a huge threat to a whole layer of jobs across the major economies, and workers are going to find it very difficult to get jobs unless there's sufficient growth out of this robotized economy. All these factors are coming together and challenging the ability of capitalism to deliver what we need. And I don't think it can reset the economy on a capitalist basis to deliver the social need. So what we need is not a war economy, but a social economy based on a socialist ownership of the means of production democratically planned. Till we get that, it's increasingly clear that capitalism cannot deliver what the millions and billions of people in this world need and require in order to have a decent living standard.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was excellent. I'll bring in Joseph, and then after Joseph's done, I'll just make a couple of announcements about some events that are coming up.
Thanks. Is my microphone working now?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, I'll carry on. If it stops working, give me a shout. Well, thanks for all the questions, and thanks to Michael Roberts for answering so many of them, which saves me a bit of bother. Let me begin with the question of China. And here, this is an issue on which me and Michael do have some disagreements. We were actually hoping at the Marxism event in summer this year to debate some of these issues, but unfortunately,
yeah, definitely.
Everything else, it was cancelled, and hopefully next year or the year after, we will actually be able to have a proper debate about China. But I did agree with a lot of the concrete things that Michael said about it. I think the difference is, for me, even if you have an economy which is 100% nationalized and directed by the state, you still have this global dynamic of interstate competition, inter-imperialist conflict, which imposes on particular economies a need to accumulate capital, to build up their military strength, to build up their base of industry, and which also reinforces the economic oppression and exploitation of the people in those countries. And that reflects the different political traditions me and Michael Roberts come from. I would say if you look at China, you have a combination of the old state capitalist base that was built up in China in the years after the revolution, combined with quite a lot of penetration now by private capital, often private capital linked to major multinational corporations. So it's not a pure state capitalist economy. Actually, no economy on the planet is a pure state capitalist economy. I heard a talk the other day about North Korea, that the price of rice on markets in Pyongyang goes up and down with the price of rice in Chinese markets, because so much of it goes over the border now, and because China is so tightly integrated into global capitalist markets in a whole number of areas. But there are differences. Michael touched on one of them. The capacity of the state to impose from the top down a very stringent lockdown, and I think even more important is the test and trace mechanism that can be put into place, meant that China is having the closest to a V-shaped recovery. And I agree with Michael about that. If we look at the long-term trajectory of China, I would say it's based on, number one, extraordinarily high levels of exploitation. Number two, a legacy of state capitalist development that it could use to break into new markets. And number three, the selective integration into the global economy directed by the state, particularly expanding into export markets, often in collaboration with multinational corporations such as Apple, Samsung, and so on, for which it acts as this giant assembly platform. In other words, it's following a very similar path to the path pursued by Japan and later South Korea as they sought to integrate themselves into the global economy. What's really changed in the last couple of decades in China is, first of all, I would say a long decline in profitability internally in the Chinese economy. There's a very good book collection co-edited by Michael Roberts that has a chapter on this. I don't know if Michael necessarily agrees with the content of the chapter, but for me, it's a very, very good take on the decline in profitability internally in China for very similar reasons to in the West. Secondly, wage rates have risen very sharply in China, partly as a result of class struggle in the country, but partly as a result of labor shortages. And thirdly, there's been a very sharp decline and later stagnation of those export markets in places like America and Europe. And it meant that after 2008, when these markets first collapsed, the Chinese economy couldn't simply rely on those markets to supply demand. So what you get in China is this huge, huge stimulus package in which it uses some of these internal resources that Michael Roberts spoke about to boost demand, but also unleashes this massive wall of credit in China. Something like 100% of GDP accumulated in credit expansion in China in the post-crisis years. Now, a lot of the investment actually is wasteful investment. If you look at the photographs of huge cities that have been constructed with no one living in them, airports that almost no one uses and so on, but it certainly drove the Chinese economy forwards. What it's not been able to do is find a stable path to the kind of levels of internal consumption that we see in America or Britain and so on to replace the export reliance of the Chinese economy. And again, you can look at Japan, where there was a very powerful export machinery built up in Japan based on high levels of exploitation. When Japan tried to make a shift into having growth based on internal levels of demand, what you saw is a huge real estate bubble begin to emerge in Japan. The bubble comes crashing down and Japan enters two or three decades of relative stagnation. Now, I'm not saying the path is going to be identical to that in China. China has bigger internal resources. It has a lot further to go in terms of the development of per capita wealth and so on. But you are seeing some elements of a Japanese style cycle of financial expansion, credit expansion, and potential crisis in China. You look at the real estate market and so on, you see elements of this. As I say, it won't necessarily be the same pattern, but there are elements of crisis developing in China. As I say, I don't think this is going to mean China is going to fall to the levels of growth seen in Britain and so on in the next year or two. But I think its long-term development means it's not going to enjoy 10, 12% annual growth in the way that it was 20 or 30 years ago. So there's a big shift in China, and China is not going to rescue world capitalism. Secondly, on Craig's point, there's low investment, but risky investment in financial assets. And the two are two sides of the same coin. There's low productive investment because the rate of return is extraordinarily low. The rate of profit is low, which means the capacity to invest and the incentive to invest is quite low in the productive economy. At the same time, there is what's called in the Financial Times and elsewhere, a search for yield. If you can't get a good return in the productive economy, if interest rates are extraordinarily low, what do you do with your money? You scour the globe looking for increasingly risky investments which turn a profit. You know, I remember Rwanda doing a sort of debt bond issue, and the debt bond issue was massively oversubscribed because people wanted this seemingly quite risky asset which had a high yield for investors. The problem is that every time that falters, these flows of hot cash then surge back into dollar markets, into safe investment, into gold, into treasury bonds in the US and so on, pulling the plug from under these markets, often in the global south, and causing more instability. Will there be a reversal of this trend? Will the state be able to direct investment, as to some extent the Chinese state still does? I mean, it's always been true, even under neoliberalism, that the state has played a very important role orchestrating investment. You see that in America very clearly. And, you know, Dominic Cummings clearly saw a similar kind of possibility in Britain for high-tech investment, although Cummings's departure maybe changes that aspiration among the hapless Boris Johnson government. But I don't think it's realistic in the British case. it's not realistic because the decline in profitability is an objective limitation, because the reliance of British capitalism on financial markets is not going to be reversed, and because Brexit makes this whole thing incredibly precarious right now. So I think we're not going to see high investment. On Ian Ferguson's question about central banks can play a role. I talk about a state central bank complex. I don't think we should see them entirely as separate entities, in which the state and central banks step in to try to drive through the deferral of crisis in the way that I talked about. One of the problems, though, is the capacity of central banks to do this is running up against its limits. First of all, because the interest rate is already zero, effectively, in most bits of the world, or in most major economies, and in lots of major economies, it's now turning negative. You have negative interest rates. So there are real limits to the extent to which you can use this kind of financial manipulation. Secondly, quantitative easing has a relatively limited impact on getting productive investment going, much more in fueling these sort of asset price bubbles and increasing the wealth of the wealthiest. But even the efficacy, the extent to which this is effective seems to be running down as more and more of it is done. And I think this is why you've seen in the current crisis a tilt back to much more direct state-driven forms of intervention in the economy. But again, we're seeing the limits of this. I mean, I don't think it's true, as Rishi Sunak says, that we have to sort of get Britain on a stable path in terms of its debt burden and so on. There's clearly far more leeway in the British economy, given how long-term a lot of the British debt is and so on, and how cheap it is to borrow. So I don't accept the argument for austerity. But in the long run, there clearly is a competitive process if you talk about integrated bond markets, bond markets turning against the most vulnerable economies, pushing up the price of debt and so on, and driving them towards default, particularly in the global south, particularly in weaker economies. There's a very good article on Michael Roberts' blog talking about this recently. So it's not without limits, this takes a tilt towards state and central bank intervention. Final point I want to make is about Dave's question and about Lenin's argument. Lenin says, you know, there is no crisis that capitalism can't survive if the working class are prepared to pay the price. Is that still true? Well, you know, it would be like farting in church to say Lenin was no longer relevant, and I'm not gonna say that. Of course it's true. Of course capitalism can squeeze us harder and make us pay the price. But I go back to something you know, Mark Fisher wrote in his book Capitalist Realism, where he says it's easier to envisage the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism. And I think, you know, you can turn that on its head and say capitalism isn't going to end, but the world might end. You know, you can see ways in which capitalism is making the sustainability of human life ever more perilous. That's what we mean when we talk about socialism or barbarism today. The pandemic is evidence for that. What's the alternative to that descent into barbarism today? The alternative is revolutionary socialist transformation. Now, what are the prospects of this? I agree with what Hector was saying. If you look around the world today, you're seeing that the massive expansion of the working class to close to 2 billion people. You're seeing massively rapid urbanization. You're seeing the growth of major capitalist towns and cities. You're seeing the persistence of large-scale capitalist enterprise where working class people are gathered together. But what you're not seeing is the capitalist system in its stagnant phase meeting the aspiration of these newly proletarianized layers of people. And that's why in 2019, you see explosion after explosion in Chile, in Ecuador, Puerto Rico, in Hong Kong, in Catalonia, in country after country, in Lebanon, Algeria, Sudan, and so on. It's about the system not meeting people's aspirations. And now in 2020, after months of the pandemic, you're seeing a new phase in this process. In Bolivia, you're seeing it in Nigeria, you're seeing it again in Lebanon, you saw it in Belarus. You're seeing these explosions of working class anger. The question for us is not whether the working class will fight. The working class will fight. It will fight everywhere at some point. There will be struggles from below. It's a question about whether those struggles can reach the scale, can acquire the kind of social base and can develop the resources internally, and not just the political resources, but the ideological resources that point them towards a thoroughgoing anti-capitalist alternative? Can we move from a succession of limited struggles, of political revolutions that overthrow one ruler and replace them with another capitalist ruler, as we saw in Algeria and Sudan? Can we move to a system of socialist revolution where we begin to take over the productive resources of society through collective democratic organization from below and begin to rebuild society from the bottom upwards? That's what we mean by socialist revolution, a democratic turning of society on its head, which has to be an international process, but it has to start somewhere. And what we're involved in organizations like the Socialist Workers Party, are building the ideological and political resources so that when the struggle erupts in Britain, we can begin to push the struggle in that direction towards real revolutionary transformation. And that's why I agree with the people in the discussion who said, you must join a revolutionary organization, and we would urge you to join the Socialist Workers Party. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much again, Michael and Joseph. Just in terms of, I know we've run over a little bit, so I'll just make a couple of quick announcements about things that are coming up. The first thing is, maybe you could stop spotlighting, Joseph. Be great. The first thing is that I think everyone knows it's quite difficult to transfer a real life conference into some kind of online experience. Obviously, you're far more likely to get people buzzing to come into your apartment while you're trying to introduce a Glaswegian punk when you're online. But I think the other difficulty is that often I think the best part of conferences are not just the fantastic speakers in the sessions, but are the kind of informal discussions and chats that can happen between sessions. You can learn about some fantastic new book, talk to people about how their session is going, find out more about other things that are coming up. So if you're we're interested in trying to see if we can recreate that atmosphere a bit, and that's the purpose of the online hub. And so maybe Hector can drop the link back into the chat again, but also if you go and look at your program, the link's on your program. And so that will open at 3 o'clock. It's just somewhere you can go join and keep chatting with other people, both people in our session, but other people who've been coming along to the conference about politics, how you're finding the conference, finding out more about the Socialist Workers Party, whatever you'd like. The other two things I'll announce is the final session of the conference, which is starting at 4 o'clock, is going to take place on Facebook. It's a Facebook live stream. You'll also be able to watch it on YouTube, and it's on the topic of capitalism versus life on Earth. So exploring and talking about the reality of the ecological crisis and the that's facing capitalism that a bunch of people have touched on this session. So I'll definitely encourage people to come along to that, and it's the final session of the conference. And the other thing I'll announce is obviously though the questions, debates, discussion, political organising doesn't end when this conference ends. It's, you know, we're part of a group of people who want to carry that on, not just the following weeks, but for years and years to come. And so we're just going to do a little screen share, show you a list of upcoming branch meetings and political meetings that are happening in Scotland over the next couple of weeks in all of the major cities. And so you should be able to look there and see if there's something that you're interested in coming along to. You want to find out more about what the Socialist Workers Party does, or meet up with other comrades and people in socialists and activists in your city. But I just want to say thank you again to both of our amazing speakers, but also to the really engaged discussion as well.